The Tom Woods Show, episode 1899.
Prepare to set fire to the index card of allowable opinion. Your daily dose of liberty education starts here. The Tom Woods Show.
Hey everybody, Tom Woods here. All right, I've got some stuff I want to talk about very quickly relating to Florida that needs to get out there in case you haven't seen the key article on this. But before I do that, I want to mention what I have coming up this week because I have some other topics that I want to make sure you're aware of. First of all, Anthony Sabatini, who is a state representative here in Florida and who's running for U.S. Congress, has been pretty hardcore about issues that matter here in Florida, and I'm going to be talking to him. Then also Michael Heiss of the Mises Caucus of the Libertarian Party is going to update us on what's been going on in the various state conventions around the country, because it's the goal of the Mises Caucus to restore normality to the Libertarian Party so that it's actually dominated by libertarians who care about libertarian issues. Crazy agenda that the Mises Caucus has. So we're going to talk to him about that. Then Marco Bassani has a brand new book about the decentralist federalist tradition in the United States. He's a professor at the University of Milan, and I haven't talked to him on the show for a long time, and his book is very important, and it's exactly the kind of history no one will teach you, certainly not in college or high school. Forget about it. You have to really, really seek this stuff out. So it's going to be a great week. I do have some COVID stuff I want to cover today, though, and in particular, this story about Florida, because you may have heard for some time the claim that Florida may actually not be doing as well as it appears because, well, they're covering up the numbers. That there was a whistleblower in Florida named Rebecca Jones, and she was ordered to fudge the numbers, and she heroically refused. And so all these left-wing media personalities have since flocked to her, and she's raised a ton of money through GoFundMe so that she has her own dashboard of Florida data now and all that. So this has been kind of a bit of a cloud over DeSantis. There's nothing to it, it turns out. Absolutely nothing to it. But for people who don't know the details, they might think, well, maybe there's at least a case to be made. Now, I realize this analogy may be a bit over the top, but it still does remind me of it. When in the 1930s, you had journalists who were disputing that anything was being done to the Ukrainians, even though they were being deliberately starved to death in a terror famine. Yes, it's true that Malcolm Muggeridge was reporting the truth. So you might say, well, look, you did have a reporter who was telling the truth. But the problem was because there were disputed interpretations of what was happening, it allowed people in the West to think, well, I guess nobody quite knows what's really going on over there. And likewise, the existence of this story hanging over Florida for all these many months has at least, no doubt, led some people to think, well, at least it's debatable. Maybe there is some doubt as to what's really happening in Florida. Well, the key article now that's since been published on this is by a fellow named Charles C.W. Cook from National Review, and I'll link to it at tomwoods.com/1899. Now, I've seen at least one journalist come forward and say, yeah, now that I see this, I should not have fallen for the Rebecca Jones story. And they shouldn't have. But remember, of course, it's not really that they fell for a story. It's that they wanted and needed the story to be true. Because as you'll recall, in 2020, it was fashionable to trash DeSantis and to flock to Cuomo and say Cuomo, with his harsh lockdowns, is taking the courageous path, the path informed by science. And then you have this reckless idiot down in Florida who is doing the opposite. And this fed into that because, of course, Florida has had better numbers than New York. And this makes them all crazy, of course. They can't account for this. It has better numbers than Michigan also. Michigan also another hard lockdown state, better numbers than New Jersey, and on and on. So then the question becomes, how can this be happening? And instead of thinking, well, maybe we need to rethink our whole approach to this. Maybe lockdowns aren't the solution. Instead, it was, they've got to be lying. Maybe they're just lying. So we got the Rebecca Jones story. Now, the Rebecca Jones story changed and evolved. So at the beginning, she was not initially making the radical claim that the numbers are all phony and she was ordered to fudge the numbers and she heroically refused. She wasn't initially claiming that. But when she did come to claim that, it should be clear enough how utterly implausible this is, because what you were really expecting us to believe was that, contrary to the testimony of our own eyes, Florida's hospitals were in fact bursting with COVID patients, which is all this could mean. What else could it mean to say the numbers have been fudged and the situation is much worse than we thought? What else could that mean other than, in fact, Florida's hospitals are bursting? But no doctor will tell us this, apparently. No hospital administrator will tell us this. Nobody walking down the corridors of these hospitals who could just see for himself whether this is happening or not is telling us. So we were supposed to believe that, in fact, contrary to all of our testimony and all of our own eyewitness accounts of what's actually going on in Florida hospitals, they were actually secretly overwhelmed. That's not possible. There's no way you could spread a story like that if there were absolutely nothing to it. And there turns out, of course, there was nothing to it. Now, let's first go over who this Rebecca Jones was. She's the former dashboard manager for the Florida Department of Health website. And she has clearly gone out of her way to misrepresent her position and the powers she had. She did not have the ability to change any numbers. She didn't have that kind of access. So even if she was informed that she had to do this, she couldn't do it, which is why she wouldn't have been told to do such a thing, because that had nothing to do with her job. On her own separate dashboard that she runs now, the data she cites are identical to those of the government of Florida. It's simply the way she organizes the numbers. Even there, as we'll see, she's wrong, that the authorities in Florida are actually correct. So she accused Florida's Deputy Secretary of Health of being a liar, fraud, and murderer. And so her overall claim is that she was fired because of a refusal to participate in a cover-up of the true numbers of what's going on in Florida with regard to COVID, and that her home was raided, guns were pointed at her children, and this is all because of her commitment to the truth. Now, Cook says that when you look at Rebecca Jones's personnel file, you find not only that there was no cover-up, but that the agency had done everything they could to de-escalate the situation with her, and that from the beginning, it had been their practice just to indulge her. Even in her very hiring, they knew that she had completed what's called a pretrial intervention program in Louisiana in 2018, whereby she was able to secure a no conviction record for a battery of a police officer. And they also knew that she had entered into a deferred prosecution agreement with the state of Florida in 2017 after being charged with criminal mischief. They hired her anyway. Now, somebody with a record like that would not have been hired for a particularly important role. And she was not hired for a particularly important role. She was just supposed to run a website. Cook says, with the enthusiastic help of the press, Rebecca Jones has unremittingly inflated the prominence of the position she held. And yet when one reads through the FDOH documents, that's Florida Department of Health, that chronicle the affair, one is struck by how dull and unheroic the whole thing really was. There are no whistleblowers anywhere in this story. There is no scandal. There is no grand fight for truth or justice. There's just a replacement-level government employee who repeatedly breaks the rules, who is repeatedly mollycoddled while doing so, and who is fired only when she eventually renders herself unworthy of the department's considerable grace. All right, now before we get into the really juicy stuff, let me remind you there is an easy way to diversify your portfolio, even to add Bitcoin to your retirement account, which a lot of folks have been interested in doing because they feel like crypto assets are the best opportunity to build generational wealth since the discovery of oil. And the easiest way to do this is with BitTrust IRA. They help you seamlessly and securely add cryptocurrency to your portfolio. They store your private keys in nuclear bunkers with military-grade encryption. They have a 24/7 trading platform with no minimum investments and unlimited trades, plus a team to help guide you along the way if you have any questions. They also offer the lowest trading fees in the industry. BitTrust IRA can help anyone, but they're especially helpful for folks who find the crypto world confusing to navigate and difficult and they don't know where to begin. BitTrust IRA will hold your hand through the whole process. Well, go to bittrustira.com/woods today to learn more. And for a limited time, BitTrust IRA is waiving the sign-up fee for Tom Woods Show listeners, a $50 value. That's bittrustira.com/woods. BITTRUSTIRA.com/woods. Now, when we look at the initial complaints against her, it's all very technical. So I'm going to read to you from the Cook article, and trust me, it gets juicy in a few minutes. So here's what we have. Jones's bad behavior was first formally reported on May 6, 2020, when the IT director at the FDOH, Craig Curry, emailed the department's labor relations consultant, Tiffany Hicks, quote, looking for guidance, unquote, on, quote, properly documenting actions of one of my employees and to get guidance on proper preparation in case action needs to be taken, unquote. Well, among the actions that Curry sought to document were that the employee, Rebecca Jones, had written, quote, posts on the website and social media regarding data and web product owned by the department that she works on without permission of management or communications, unquote. That she had released infographics that, quote, should have been identical to data published by our communication department, unquote, but were not. And most seriously, that she had possibly exposed personnel data in the process. Asked to clarify the problem by Hicks, Curry confirmed that between April 9th and April 30th, 2020, he had verbally told Jones to stop talking to the press without permission, and more specifically that he had told her to stop releasing health department data or representing her employer without consent. In her response to Curry, sent later that day, Hicks proposed one of two actions, that Jones should either be separated, i.e. fired, or else be put through a management consulting procedure that would, quote, address and document the recent incidents. The latter process, Hicks explained, would be informal and would not be placed in the employee's personnel file. But if similar behavior continues, she added, it is management's decision to move forward with termination. Well, apparently they chose this second action because she was still working at the FDOH by the end of the day, but she had been replaced as primary on the COVID dashboard. And so Jones was informed that she was maintaining her role as GIS team manager and was to resume normal day-to-day responsibilities, but she was to cease any duties and administrative role associated with the COVID-19 GIS dashboard. The next day, May 7th, 2020, Jones crashed the dashboard. She created a new account, moved a whole bunch of data into it, breaking the setup. The team thought there was some system issue, so they started working on it. But then it turns out that, no, it was Rebecca Jones screwing with the system. So Chris Duclos, who was a GIS manager, GIS, by the way, is Geographic Information System. He's the only other person beside Rebecca Jones who had full administrative rights in the system to help with a problem like this. And so what he did was he rolled the system back to how it had been back when it was working. And when Jones realized that Duclos was more or less reversing her power grab, she locked him out of his account. She was then ordered to restore Duclos's full administrative access. 6.5 hours later, she said she would, but then said, well, I'm heading out to spend some time with family in Mississippi. And then not only did she not restore his administrative access, she set his permissions to a lower level than administrator and left herself as the only person in the FDOH who had administrator status. And then about a week later, she sent out an email saying that the reason she wasn't running the dashboard anymore was her refusal to participate in a cover-up. She accused the Florida Deputy Secretary of Health, who's Dr. Shamariel Roberson, who happens to be the first Black person to hold that post. Rebecca Jones accused her of asking me to go into the raw data and manually alter figures. Jones's initial story was not that she was ordered to fudge the numbers. The Associated Press back in May 2020 said that she had not alleged, quote, any tampering with data on deaths, hospital symptom surveillance, hospitalizations for COVID-19, numbers of new confirmed cases, or overall testing rates, and that she even acknowledged that, quote, Florida has been relatively transparent. So why did she not initially make these allegations? Because, as Cook points out, Obviously, she wasn't in a senior enough position to have been able to make changes to the data. She didn't have the ability to edit the raw data as the manager of the dashboard. There were only a handful of people in the whole state with permission to touch that information. She wasn't one of them. Every day she was given a copy of the data, and it was her job to upload it into the system. So if she had decided to alter that, everyone would have seen that immediately. Now, why has not a single person in the Florida Department of Health sided with her? Not one other person is going to point out that one of the greatest scandals in American history has just occurred, that a state Department of Health has tried to cover up numbers in a pandemic? Not one person? Or how about, why hasn't there been some New York Times expose on the whole thing? And the answer is because there's no story. She didn't build the data system, which is her claim now. She's not a data manager. Her job was to export other people's work, to export data over which she had no control, and to put it up nicely on the state dashboard. And remember, on her rebel dashboard that she's set up thanks to money she's gotten from gullible leftists, she admits that she uses the Department of Health's data. If you access the data from both sources, she says, you'll see that it is identical. All she's doing is displaying them differently. So what exactly is she doing with the data? Like, what's the big deal here? If the numbers are all basically okay, then what's the problem? She's complaining that the Department of Health is not processing the data the way it would be processed if she were in charge. But why would it do that? She has no expertise in this area. Her complaints are not valid. She's saying that Florida is hiding deaths because in its headline numbers, it's not including non-residents. But it does report those deaths. It just reports them separately, which is what the CDC asks them to do. She's claiming that Florida's excess death number is suspicious. But as Cook says, that too has been rigorously debunked by pretty much everyone who understands what excess deaths means in an epidemiological context, including by the CDC, by Daniel Weinberger, an epidemiologist at the Yale School of Public Health, by Lauren Rawson, a statistician at the CDC's National Center for Health Statistics, and most notably by Jason Salemi, an epidemiologist at the University of South Florida, who, having gone to the trouble of making a video explaining calmly why the talking point was false, was then bullied off Twitter by Jones and her followers. And by the way, that's happened to one person after another on social media who has tried to criticize Rebecca Jones. They get called a sexist because she's a woman, or a racist, who knows why, or you're part of the alt-right because what else are you going to say to people? Then it's because you're a stooge for Ron DeSantis or Putin, of course. And then you're an opponent of science, whatever. I mean, it's all absurdities. Cook points out that Jones has a history of taking her own bad behavior and somehow transforming it into victimhood, that somehow she's the aggrieved party. So she wrote in 2019 a 342-page manifesto in which she portrays herself as the injured one, even in passages where she's talking about engaging with an ex-boyfriend after violating a no-contact order, damaging his car, harassing his mother. She portrays herself as the victim in the parts in which she talks about how she was fired from FSU, Florida State University, for having sex with a student in her office and lying to her employer about her criminal record. He says, everywhere Jones goes, whether it's Louisiana State University, Florida State, or the Florida Department of Health, she seems always to leave a trail of wreckage, and somehow it's always someone else's fault. Now, much of the attention that she's gotten and the celebrity that she's accumulated can be traced to her claim that Governor DeSantis heard about her whistleblowing and so used his Gestapo to raid her house and put her children in danger. This is not the case. The police executed a warrant on her, but the reason for this was that a data breach at the Florida Department of Health, in which 19,000 employees had their personal information stolen, was traced back to her IP address. DeSantis had nothing to do with it. The search warrant, and by the way, that warrant says Jones committed a felony, not only by accessing personnel data she had no right to access, but permanently stealing it was initially signed, indeed, by a Republican appointee, Judge Joshua Hawks, but was upheld by Judge John Cooper, who was an elected judge in heavily Democratic Leon County. So Jones says she was terrified by this police visit, but Cook is skeptical because he says, if you're really surprised that the cops are at the door, you probably wouldn't have put a Biden hire me sign on the door, obviously intended for the cameras. But then her claims about the behavior of the police, that the agents pointed a gun at my face, they pointed guns at my kids. Well, we have the body cam video, and it, quote, does not appear to show police pointing their guns at anyone in the house. That's from the Tampa Bay Times. It shows the police waited outside for 22 minutes. They encouraged her to come talk to them at the door. They called her repeatedly to ask why she wasn't cooperating. And then the Florida Department of Law Enforcement released the footage. You can see for yourself, nobody pointed a gun at anybody during the entire thing. But they did find enough in her house that another judge in heavily Democratic Leon County signed a warrant for her arrest, and so she has turned herself in. So it's a crazy story, and it doesn't show anything about anything. And as I say, the initial claim is not plausible. If there is a raging pandemic going on, as a result of which the hospitals are completely stuffed to the gills with COVID patients, that would get out. The public would find out about that. You cannot cover up an overwhelm of the entire state hospital system. So anyway, you'll find more detail in the Cook article, which I'll link again, as I said, at the show notes page, tomwoods.com/1899. And I want to remind you again, because the window of opportunity for doing this is closing quickly, that if you'd like to get access to that documentary that I was interviewed for, then you got to go register for it before they actually start selling it. Because before they start selling it, they're going to premiere it to the public for free, and you can watch it for free as long as you sign up in advance. It's called Endgame, and they wrote to me. I found out later there's one person on the staff of this documentary film company that said, you have to interview Tom Woods. And they actually did not know who Tom Woods was. But they couldn't get this guy off their back. So they said, okay, fine, we'll interview him. And then afterward, now I'm like their best friend. Now they email me a couple times a week, and they all love me, and that's really great and everything. But we talked about a lot of important topics. I mean, I talked, because the idea of this documentary is that it's not just COVID, but that's really shown that the authoritarian tendencies of the regimes we all live under. But there's just so much more going on. I mean, the long-term economic consequences of what's been done, and the civil liberties violations, and the big tech suppression of dissident voices, and the schools are a mess, and they're engines of propaganda. All these things happening at once, and there's a legitimate question: what in the world am I supposed to do faced with the opposition of what seems like the entire world? Where is this all going, and what am I supposed to do about it? So when they asked me, would I want to be interviewed on a topic like that, I said, yeah, would I? Yeah, absolutely I would. And I did it, as I may have told you. I was not feeling well. I was feverish, but I had already rescheduled with them. I was feverish. I had the chills. I looked pale as a ghost. I don't even sound like myself because of the cold that I had. But I did it, and doggone it, I was tired afterward, but I brought my A game to this thing. So they've interviewed a whole lot of people for this docuseries, and I know you're going to like it. I've promoted other documentaries that they've produced, and they've all been great. They've done documentaries on wine, on pain management. I mean, as you can see, completely varied topics. But they did a great one on money, where they had our friend Tom Woods show guest John Mackey and G. Edward Griffin, and names that are familiar to us. So they're very sympathetic to our point of view. So go sign up so that you can watch this documentary for free at tomwoods.com/endgame. So go do that. tomwoods.com/endgame. And I don't know which episode's going to be me, but if you sign up, you'll get it one of these days. So hurry up and do that before that window closes. And I think that's all I want to say about all this. So thanks so much, everybody. See you tomorrow.
Become a smarter libertarian in just 30 minutes a day. Visit tomwoods.com to subscribe to the show for free, and we'll see you next time.
Like the sound of The Tom Woods Show? My audio production is provided by Podsworth Media. Check them out at podsworth.com.